The September sun hammered Willow Springs with forge heat, baking wooden sidewalks until they cracked and turning the brass water pump scalding to touch. Lone Bear shifted in his saddle leather, warm against his thighs, as he studied the settlement sprawled before him like a festering wound across the prairie. 3 weeks had passed since a cavalry saber carved its reminder along his ribs, a constant ache that whispered warnings about treaties written by men who measured honor in silver coin. His paint horse snorted, ears pricked at tension crackling through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Beside him, cousins, 2 elks, and Swift Crow sat their mounts with fluid alertness of men who'd learned to sleep with weapons within reach. Their Spencer carbines lay across saddle pommels, 7-shot repeaters that could drop a charging cavalry unit before sabers closed distance. Bad medicine here. Swift Crow muttered in Cheyenne, working sweetgrass between scarred teeth. Like grandmother's stories about the place where bluecoats came in winter snow. Lone Bear's jaw tightened at the reference. His grandmother had survived Sand Creek, though survival came at prices that haunted her dreams until the grave. Her final words still echoed in his memory, spoken with fevered intensity as death approached. Promise me, grandson, if you find someone with warrior's heart trapped in white world, you help them fight. The green-eyed woman will come seeking justice for the same crimes that took my sister's children. When she does, you stand with her. Some battles need both worlds to win. He'd thought it delirium then. Now watching the unnatural stillness of Willow Springs, he wondered if his grandmother had possessed the sight that came to some in their final moments. They'd come for seed corn promised in trade by merchants who needed Cheyenne pelts more than they feared Cheyenne presence. But the settlement felt coiled tight as a spring trap today, all wrong rhythms, and held breath. The crowd at the town well should have been ordinary housewives drawing water for evening meals, children playing in whatever coolness the structure's shadow provided, men discussing weather and politics with farmers' eternal optimism. Instead, armed figures lurked in doorways while women clutched their young closer than washing baskets. Then she burst through the crowd, like a spirit fleeing the underworld itself. The white woman stumbled forward with desperate energy of something hunted beyond endurance, her once fine calico dress torn at the shoulder and stained with rust-colored patches that might have been blood or tears. Raw rope burns circled her wrists like twisted jewelry, the flesh weeping despite attempts to conceal them with torn fabric. Auburn hair had escaped its pins to hang in matted waves, around a face that spoke of intelligence pushed past breaking, but not yet broken. She stopped before Lone Bear's horse and looked up with eyes the color of spring grass after rain, brilliant green and burning with fever or determination or both. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the suddenly silent street, each word precise despite tremors shaking her slender frame. "Warrior," she said, pressing palms together in supplication that somehow managed to maintain dignity even in desperation. "I beg you marry me. Right here, right now, before these witnesses and whatever gods hold you sacred." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the prairie wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the very air understood that something momentous hung in the balance. 2 men emerged from the saloon's shadow, with the casual menace of predators scenting wounded prey. Tom Callahan showed broken yellow teeth in what might have been a smile, his hand resting on a Navy Colt that had seen more use than most tools. His partner Pete McKenna moved beside him with the fluid grace of a knife fighter, poison in his pale eyes and murder in the set of his narrow shoulders. "Well, ain't that just pitiful as a 3-legged dog in a race?" Tom drawled, Missouri accent thick as sorghum molasses. "Poor little gal's gone completely tetched in the head. Been having fits and spells something fierce, ain't you, darlin'?" The woman Lillian, someone whispered like a prayer or curse, kept her palms pressed together, but her gaze remained steady and calculating. Madness didn't usually come wrapped in such tactical awareness, such careful positioning that kept the water trough between her and the saloon's other occupants. Marriage would protect me under territorial law, she announced, voice loud enough for every soul in earshot to witness. A husband's rights supersede guardianship proceedings. You'd be saving my life and my property from legal theft disguised as medical care. Pete spat tobacco juice in a brown stream that barely missed her torn skirts. Lady's been declared mentally incompetent by proper legal authority. Time to come back where you belong, for you hurt yourself or somebody else. Marshal Quiet Quentin emerged from his office with the reluctant steps of a man walking toward his own hanging. Everyone knew Maxim Rourke's money kept the marshal's badge polished and his jail's roof from leaking. Justice in Willow Springs bent whichever way the prophet Wayne's blew strongest. Lone Bear felt the weight of watching eyes, the pressure of choices that could cascade into bloodshed faster than prairie fire consuming autumn grass. His cousin's tensed hands shifting toward weapons with the fluid readiness of men who'd survived more ambushes than they cared to count. Rifle barrels emerged from windows like metallic serpents tasting the air for violence. The woman swayed on her feet, and something deeper than tactical thinking moved him to action. He swung down from his horse with careful grace, landing light, despite the healing wound that pulled at his ribs. Without hesitation, he stepped between her and the approaching men, creating a barrier with his body that spoke louder than words. She reached toward him with hands that shook like aspen leaves in storm wind, and he caught them gently, surprised by skin that burned with fever, yet remained steady in its grip. For a heartbeat that stretched like eternity, they stood close enough to share breath while the street held its collective inhale. Her pulse raced beneath his fingers, but her grip was strong and her gaze unflinching. Whatever had driven her to this desperate gambit, she possessed steel enough to see it through. In her eyes, he saw not madness, but fierce intelligence, not weakness, but determination, bent nearly to breaking, yet refusing to snap. "Step aside, Redskin," Tom growled, moving closer, with the swagger of a man accustomed to intimidating his betters. "This here's white folks' business, nothing that concerns savages like you." Lone Bear's voice, when he spoke, carried the quiet authority of a war leader who'd earned respect through deed rather than bluster. "The woman asked for my protection. Among my people, such requests carry the weight of sacred obligation." Pete's hand moved to the coiled rope at his belt fingers, working the hemp with practiced ease. "Don't matter what weight it carries with savages. Our law says she comes with us willing or not." The crowd pressed closer, forming a living wall of tension and barely restrained violence. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts, while men checked their ammunition with the unconscious precision of those who'd learned that survival often depended on counting bullets correctly. Lone Bear could feel Lillian's racing pulse, where his fingers still rested near her wrists. Despite fever and exhaustion that racked her frame, she stood straight as a lodgepole pine. Whatever secrets lay hidden behind those intelligent eyes, whatever truth had driven her to seek protection from a Cheyenne warrior rather than her own people, she'd chosen him as her shield against forces that would destroy her. The choice, when it came, felt inevitable as sunrise after the darkest night. He moved closer to her, using his body to create shelter between her and the men who meant harm. His voice carried across the silent street with perfect clarity. "Then we have much to discuss and damn little time for talking." The uneasy peace between Willow Springs and the Cheyenne camp along Ash River had taken 6 months to negotiate and could shatter in 6 seconds. Lone Bear had opposed the arrangement from the beginning, arguing that white promises carried less weight than spider silk in wind. But winter approached with its hunger, and his people needed grain more than they needed pride. The town's power structure was as rigid as river ice and twice as treacherous. Maxim Rourke owned the Triple R Ranch, 30,000 acres of prime grazing land that stretched from the settlement to the territorial borders. His longhorn cattle drank from streams he'd claimed through a combination of legal documentation and strategic violence, while his political influence reached clear to the territorial capital and beyond. Rourke's enforcers moved through Willow Springs, like wolves marking territory with blood and fear. Tom Crooked Teeth Callahan had earned his nickname during a saloon fight that left him permanently disfigured, but considerably more dangerous, a walking reminder that crossing the boss carried permanent consequences. His partner, Pete Poison McKenna, possessed the lean build and dead eyes of a man who killed for pleasure rather than mere profit. Dr. Malcolm Humphrey represented what passed for the settlement's conscience. The London-educated physician maintained his integrity through careful neutrality, treating bullet wounds and birthing babies without asking awkward questions about politics or race. His clinic occupied a frame building near the town center, close enough to reach emergencies, but far enough from the saloon to avoid most recreational violence. Hannah Morrison taught school in a cramped wooden structure that doubled as meeting hall when circuit preachers came through. Her Eastern education made her useful enough to tolerate despite unconventional ideas about women's capabilities and racial equality. The schoolhouse sat on the settlement's edge where children could see the vast prairie stretching toward horizons that promised either opportunity or destruction. Joseph Brennan farmed the marginal land north of town, his wheat withering in the drought that had gripped the territory for 2 brutal years. His debts to Rourke mounted like storm clouds, dark with the promise of foreclosure and ruin. His 6-year-old daughter Mary was the light of his life and his primary motivation for enduring humiliations that would have broken weaker men. And then there was Lillian Brennan Joseph's late cousin's widow, who'd arrived 3 months ago carrying a carpet bag and a letter of introduction that seemed legitimate enough to satisfy casual inspection. But Lillian had asked too many questions about water rights and property boundaries. She'd spent hours examining survey maps at the territorial office, taking notes with the methodical precision of someone building a legal case. Worst of all, she'd begun questioning why so many family properties had been transferred to Rourke's ownership through guardianship proceedings and convenient tax sales. What the townspeople didn't know was that Lillian's knowledge came from secret lessons taught by her father in their cabin's root cellar, away from disapproving eyes and wagging tongues. He'd been a man ahead of his time, believing that his daughter deserved education beyond domestic skills. "Knowledge is power, little green eyes," he'd whispered during those clandestine sessions. But power in a woman's hands is dangerous to those who profit from ignorance. Keep what I teach you hidden until the day you need it to survive. Her descent from guest to prisoner had been swift and brutal. First came accusations of hysteria and violent behavior. Then a convenient medical evaluation by a doctor in Goldwater who'd never laid eyes on her. Finally, the guardianship papers that made Rourke her legal protector and gave him control over any property she might have inherited. Now she stood in the burning September sun with rope burns on her wrists and desperation in her eyes, making a marriage proposal that would either save her life or get them all killed. Dr. Humphrey pushed through the crowd, his medical bag clutched in weathered hands that had delivered half the children in 3 counties. "Perhaps we might examine the lady before making hasty decisions. Medical evaluation seems prudent under these circumstances." Tom spat brown tobacco juice that barely missed the doctor's polished boots. "Ain't nothing wrong with her that a good dose of laudanum won't cure permanent like. Gets these violent fits, Doc. Yesterday she went after Pete here with a butcher knife, didn't you, darling?" Pete displayed a bandaged forearm with theatrical precision, though Lone Bear's trained eye noted the binding was too clean and fresh to be genuine. The wound had been self-inflicted, probably with a razor rather than a knife applied with the skill of someone accustomed to creating convincing lies. Marshal Quentin stepped forward, his star catching sunlight like a signal mirror. His voice carried the weary tone of a man caught between duty and survival. The magistrate in Goldwater issued proper papers declaring Miss Brennan here a ward of the county. Mr. Rourke's been appointed her legal guardian due to her documented condition. What condition might that be? Lone Bear asked, his dark eyes studying Lillian with the intensity of a tracker reading difficult sign in dangerous country. Female hysteria. Pete replied quickly, his pale eyes never leaving Lillian's face. Gets the strength of 10 men when the madness takes her. Why, just last week she near strangled a perfectly innocent doctor who was trying to help her with her prescribed medicine. Lillian's green eyes flashed with anger, too focused for genuine madness. I defended myself when they tried to force laudanum into my veins against my will. Any woman would fight such treatment. She paused, her voice dropping to deadly quiet that somehow carried farther than shouting. Though I reckon some men prefer their women drugged senseless for easier handling. The barb hit home like a well-aimed arrow. Pete's face darkened with embarrassment and rage. But before he could respond, Rourke himself made his entrance, emerging from the saloon like a king holding court. His silver hair was perfectly groomed despite the heat, his black suit immaculate enough for a funeral or a wedding. He moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to owning everything he surveyed, including the people. Miss Brennan requires immediate medical supervision, he said, his cultured voice carrying easily across the crowd, despite its conversational tone. These episodes come without warning and often involve violence against those attempting to provide proper care. Lillian touched her dress seam with a gesture so subtle that most observers would miss it entirely. But Lone Bear had learned to read such movements during years of warfare, where survival depended on recognizing hidden weapons and concealed intentions. She was carrying something, papers perhaps, or other evidence that powerful men would kill to suppress. Hannah Morrison pushed forward from the schoolhouse, her plain brown dress marked with chalk dust, and her eyes bright with suppressed fury. I've spoken with Miss Brennan several times, Mr. Rourke. She seemed perfectly rational to me, more so than most adults in this settlement, if I'm being honest. School marms ain't doctors, honey. Tom growled, but his hand moved away from his gun when Hannah's steady gaze met his. The schoolteacher had earned a reputation for facing down troublemakers with the same determination she used to teach arithmetic to reluctant students. Dr. Humphrey cleared his throat diplomatically. I propose a medical examination to determine Miss Brennan's current condition. Surely that would satisfy all parties concerned. Rourke's smile held no warmth whatsoever. Provided she's properly restrained during the examination. Her condition makes her extremely dangerous, particularly to medical personnel attempting treatment. I'll not examine anyone in restraints, Humphrey said firmly, his London accent more pronounced when he was angry. My oath requires dignity for all patients, regardless of their circumstances or the accusations against them. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring in a master archer's hands. Tom's fingers drummed against his holster while Pete coiled his rope with the fluid motions of someone who'd used it for more than cattle. Marshal Quentin looked between Rourke's expectant face and Lone Bear's implacable stance, calculating which choice offered better odds of living through the afternoon. Lone Bear felt Lillian shift position slightly, placing herself to run if violence erupted while staying close enough to his protection to benefit from whatever cover his presence might provide. Smart woman, she understood the deadly mathematics of their situation as clearly as he did. The church bell tolled again, marking noon with brazen certainty. Time was running out like water through cupped hands, and every second of delay brought them closer to the kind of violence that would leave Willow Springs permanently stained with the memory of blood. I will stand surety for her safety during the examination. Lone Bear announced his words, carrying the finality of a war chief's judgment. Dr. Humphrey will determine her condition without interference from interested parties. Rourke's eyes narrowed to calculating slits that promised future retribution. And if she proves dangerous during this examination, who accepts responsibility for any injuries that might result? I do. Lone Bear replied without hesitation, completely and without reservation or condition. The words transformed the equation from simple confrontation to something far more complex and dangerous. By accepting responsibility for Lillian's actions, Lone Bear had made himself a target for anyone seeking to harm her. But he'd also given her the protection of Cheyenne law, which recognized no authority higher than a warrior's given word. Lillian's sharp intake of breath was barely audible, but he felt her shoulders straighten with something that might have been hope. Around them, the crowd stirred restlessly as the implications of his declaration penetrated minds accustomed to simpler forms of frontier justice. Dr. Humphrey's clinic provided blessed relief from the scorching sun, though tension followed them through the door, like an unwelcome shadow that refused to be left outside. The interior smelled of carbolic acid and healing herbs, a combination that spoke of life preserved against overwhelming odds. Lillian sat on the examination table with forced composure, her torn dress revealing more than she likely intended. The rope burns around her wrists were worse than they'd appeared outside deep grooves in the flesh that spoke of prolonged struggle against restraints designed to hold wild animals rather than human beings. But it was the needle marks along her forearms that made Lone Bear's jaw clench with barely restrained fury. Lone Bear positioned himself near the door with the tactical awareness of a man who'd learned that escape routes often meant the difference between life and death. His dark eyes cataloged potential weapons, surgical instruments that could serve as blades, bottles of medicine that could blind attackers, the heavy wooden desk that would stop most bullets. Dr. Humphrey worked with the gentle efficiency of someone who treated everything from bullet wounds to difficult births. His trained fingers explored the rope burns with professional detachment, while his eyes grew increasingly angry at the evidence he uncovered. These injuries are consistent with prolonged restraint, he murmured loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. The pattern suggests repeated struggles over an extended period, weeks, possibly months of confinement. Marshal Quentin hovered near the window, like a man afraid to commit to either side of the conflict developing around him. Through the glass, Tom and Pete waited with the patience of buzzards, their weapons serving as visible reminders of the violence held in check by the thinnest margins of civilized behavior. "What about them violent fits, Doc?" Tom called through the open window, his voice carrying the false concern of a practiced liar. "The ones that make her so dangerous to decent folks." Dr. Humphrey examined Lillian's arms more closely, finding evidence that made his eyebrows rise toward his graying hairline. Small puncture wounds marked the inside of her left elbow, some fresh others partially healed. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone with medical training. "Miss Brennan," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of her own racing heartbeat. "Have you been receiving regular injections of laudanum or similar substances against your will?" "Every morning and evening for the past 6 weeks. She whispered, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd endured systematic torture disguised as medical care. "They held me down while a man claiming to be a doctor forced needles into my veins. Said it was for my own good to calm my feminine hysteria and make me more manageable for proper treatment." The physician's jaw tightened with professional outrage. Laudanum addiction was a scourge that destroyed lives with ruthless efficiency, particularly among women whose emotional distress was dismissed as inherent weakness rather than reasonable response to intolerable circumstances. The injection sites show clear evidence of struggle. He observed his voice carrying clearly enough for the watchers outside to hear every word. "This pattern is entirely inconsistent with voluntary medical treatment. These wounds were inflicted during forced restraint by someone with medical knowledge, but questionable ethics. Lone Bear's hands clenched into fists as the implications sank home like arrows finding their mark. Among his people, poisoning someone was considered the ultimate act of cowardice, the weapon of those too weak to face their enemies with honor. That white men would drug a woman into submission spoke to a corruption of spirit that sickened him to his core. "She's been plenty violent, Doc." Pete insisted from his position outside the window, his voice carrying the whine of a man whose lies were being exposed. "Clawed my arm something fierce just yesterday when I tried to give her the medicine prescribed by a qualified physician." Dr. Humphrey turned his attention to examining the wounds Lillian was accused of inflicting. What he found made his expression shift from professional interest to barely concealed disgust. "These scratches appear to be self-inflicted, Mr. McKenna," he announced with clinical precision that cut through the afternoon heat like a blade. "The angle and depth are entirely inconsistent with defensive wounds caused by another person struggling against restraint." Pete's face darkened with the fury of a caught liar. "You calling me a liar, Doc? I'm providing medical observations based on physical evidence." Humphrey replied evenly, his London training serving him well in the face of frontier intimidation. "These injuries were caused by your own fingernails, possibly while scratching at insect bites or similar skin irritation." The lie unraveled like cheap rope under strain, but lies backed by guns and money possess their own form of truth on the frontier, where might often defined right more effectively than law or morality. Marshal Quentin shifted uncomfortably caught between medical evidence and political necessity that could cost him his badge or his life. That's when Rourke made his entrance, filling the small clinic with a presence that seemed to suck oxygen from the air. His expensive cologne couldn't quite mask the scent of leather and power that clung to his clothes, like the smell of money made manifest. "Doctor," he said with cultured politeness that contained undertones of steel, "I appreciate your thoroughness, but legal documents supersede medical opinions in matters of competency determination." He produced folded papers from his coat pocket, the wax seals still intact, but somehow carrying the stench of corruption despite their official appearance. "Miss Brennan requires supervised care due to her documented mental instability and history of violent episodes toward medical personnel." Lillian's composure cracked slightly, revealing the desperation she'd been fighting to conceal. "That magistrate never examined me, never even spoke to me. How could he declare me incompetent based on purchased testimony from men who profit from my confinement?" Her voice turned razor sharp, with barely controlled fury. "Unless, of course, Uncle Maxime, you prefer your legal proceedings as fictional as your family concern." The word uncle hung in the air, like the echo of a gunshot, transforming the entire dynamic of their confrontation. Rourke's carefully constructed mask slipped for just an instant, revealing something that might have been surprise before his cultured composure returned like armor sliding back into place. "My dear child," he said with smooth condescension that fooled no one in the room, "your illness clearly affects your memory as well as your judgment. You're obviously confused about family relationships that exist only in your fevered imagination." But Lillian's green eyes blazed with sudden understanding, pieces of a puzzle she'd been trying to solve for months, finally clicking into place. "My memory's perfectly clear, Uncle. Clear enough to remember the stories my father told about his older brother who'd sell his own mother for the right price. Clear enough to recall why he left home and never looked back." The revelation hung between them like smoke from a signal fire, heavy with implications that reached far beyond simple guardianship proceedings. Dr. Humphrey continued his examination, but his eyes kept darting between the two antagonists as he began to understand the true scope of what he was witnessing. Medically speaking, he announced after completing his assessment, I find no evidence of mental instability whatsoever. Miss Brennan shows clear signs of laudanum withdrawal, malnutrition, and physical restraint. But her cognitive function appears entirely normal. In fact, her reasoning abilities seem quite remarkable for someone who's endured such systematic abuse. Your opinion is noted, Doctor. Rourke said with dismissive courtesy that carried implicit threats. However, legal documents remain valid regardless of contrary medical findings or personal opinions. Lone Bear studied the papers Rourke held with the intensity of a tracker reading sign that would determine whether his people lived or died. Something about the documents felt wrong. Too convenient, too perfectly timed, carrying that particular stench that surrounded legal theft disguised as righteous concern. Your papers may be legal, Lone Bear said finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority that made hardened fighters listen without question. But legality and justice walked different paths in this territory. Rourke's smile turned predatory, revealing teeth as white and sharp as a wolf's fangs. Justice is a luxury we can't afford on the frontier, warrior. Law is what keeps civilization from sliding into chaos and savagery like your people represent. Sometimes, Lone Bear replied, his hand moving to rest on his knife hilt with casual precision. What you call civilization is just organized savagery with better paperwork. The temperature in the room seemed to drop despite the blazing heat outside. Tom and Pete pressed closer to the windows, their weapons now openly displayed as threats rather than implied possibilities. Marshal Quentin's breathing quickened as he calculated odds that seemed to favor violence no matter which choice he made. Dr. Humphrey stepped between the potential combatants with the kind of courage that came from treating gunshot wounds and knowing exactly how much damage bullets could do to human flesh. Perhaps we might discuss this matter somewhere more appropriate. My clinic hardly seems suitable for negotiations of this nature. No negotiations are necessary, Rourke declared with finality that brooked no argument. The law is clear regardless of personal opinions. Miss Brennan returns to my custody immediately. That's when the first shot shattered the clinic's front window in an explosion of glass and transformed tension into deadly reality. Glass fragments rained down like deadly hail, forcing everyone to dive for whatever cover the small clinic could provide. Lone Bear pulled Lillian behind the examination table, his body shielding hers from the shower of razor-sharp splinters that could blind or kill as effectively as bullets. "Stay low and do exactly what I tell you," he murmured in her ear, his breath warm against hair that smelled of fear and determination. "When I move, you move. When I stop, you stop. Trust me completely, or we both die badly." Outside, horses screamed in terror, while men shouted orders that were lost in the chaos of gunfire and shattering wood. What had been a tense negotiation had erupted into the kind of violence that would leave the frontier town permanently marked by blood and bitter memory. Dr. Humphrey crouched behind his heavy desk, clutching his medical bag like a talisman against the bullets that punched through the clinic's thin walls with the regularity of a deadly heartbeat. Marshal Quentin had drawn his weapon, but seemed paralyzed by indecision, unsure who represented the greater threat to his continued existence. Rourke pressed himself against the far wall, his immaculate suit now torn by flying glass, and his carefully groomed appearance disheveled for the first time since anyone could remember. For the first time since his arrival, the cattle baron looked less than completely confident in his ability to control the situation through money and intimidation. Another shot splintered the door frame inches from Lillian's head, the impact showering them with wood fragments that stung like angry wasps. She pressed closer to Lone Bear, drawing strength from his steady presence, while her mind raced through possibilities for survival that seemed increasingly remote. 2 elks, Lone Bear called in Cheyenne through the broken window, switching to his native tongue to prevent their enemies from understanding tactical communications. Report positions. Tom's behind the water trough with a Winchester, came the reply in the same language. Pete's in the alley with what looks like a Spencer. At least 4 others in various positions around the building. Too many angles for a clean fight. They've got us boxed like rabbits in a burrow. Lone Bear absorbed this tactical information, while his hands automatically checked his weapons with the precision of long practice. His Colt Navy revolver rode easy in its holster 6 shots that would have to count for everything. His knife weighted at his belt, sharp enough to shave and balanced for throwing. But steel and lead meant nothing without proper positioning and timing. "Doc," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off the tactical situation developing around them, "is there another way out of this building that doesn't involve walking straight into gunfire?" Humphrey nodded toward a door behind his examination area, his face pale but determined. "Through the storeroom to the back alley." "But that's where Pete's positioned. You'd be walking straight into his sights like sheep to slaughter." Another bullet crashed through the remaining window glass, sending bottles of medicine cascading from their shelves in a symphony of destruction. The sweet smell of laudanum mixed with carbolic acid created a cloying atmosphere that made breathing difficult and thinking even harder. Lillian shifted against him, her lips close to his ear, as she whispered urgently, "There's something you need to know about why they want me back alive. It's not just about guardianship. There's property involved that could change the balance of power in this entire territory." "Tell me later," Lone Bear said firmly, his eyes never leaving the tactical situation developing around them like storm clouds gathering for a final assault. "Right now, we focus on staying alive long enough for later to matter." He studied the clinic's layout with a warrior's eye for defensive advantages and escape routes. The examination table would stop small-caliber bullets, but wouldn't stand up to rifle fire. The doctor's desk offered better protection, but limited their movement options. The real problem was the building's location. Too many windows, too many angles of attack, too much open ground in every direction they might try to flee. Marshal Quentin finally found either his courage or his survival instincts. "This is Marshal Quentin." He shouted toward the street, his voice cracking with strain. "Cease fire immediately. This is a lawful detention proceeding under territorial authority." Tom's laughter drifted through the broken glass, harsh as a crow's cry, echoing across a battlefield littered with the dead. "Detention nothing. That crazy woman's got herself a gun and she's threatening innocent citizens. We got every right to defend ourselves." The lie was smoothly delivered and designed to justify whatever violence followed. Lone Bear had seen this tactic before: create chaos, blame the victims, then clean up the mess with bullets and shallow graves while claiming self-defense and righteous protection of the community. "I need a weapon," Lillian whispered urgently, her green eyes bright with determination rather than fear. "I can shoot straight. My father taught me proper when I was 12 years old, back when he still hoped I'd need to defend myself against more than just legal proceedings." Dr. Humphrey overheard and reached into his desk drawer, producing a small derringer with pearl grips, worn smooth by years of handling. "My father's service weapon from the Mexican War," he said, offering it to her with hands that trembled only slightly. "2 shots, but accurate at close range if you aim carefully and squeeze the trigger gently." Lone Bear guided her hands around the grip, his calloused fingers covering hers to demonstrate proper stance and sight alignment. "They hold steady, breathe out halfway, then squeeze gentle like you're crushing an eggshell. Aim for the center of whatever you're shooting at, bigger target than trying for arms or legs." Her hand steadied under his touch, drawing confidence from his calm competence in the face of violence that would have terrified most people into paralysis. For a moment, they were connected by more than shared danger, their breathing synchronized as he passed along knowledge that might keep her alive through the next few minutes. The clinic's back door exploded inward, then Pete's boot sending it crashing against the wall hard enough to crack the wooden frame. He entered with his Spencer rifle raised, expecting to find cowering victims instead of prepared adversaries ready to fight for their lives. Lone Bear moved like striking lightning, his knife clearing its sheath in one fluid motion that spoke of countless hours of practice, and several occasions where speed had meant the difference between life and death. The blade took Pete in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the floor in a spray of blood and profanity. Pete crashed into medical equipment with a cry of pain and rage, his gun hand clutching the wound that stained his shirt with spreading crimson. "You red bastard!" He snarled, fumbling for his sidearm with his offhand while blood leaked between his fingers. "I'll gut you slow for that." But Lone Bear was already moving, crossing the room in 3 swift strides that covered ground like a hunting cat closing on wounded prey. Pete's revolver cleared leather just as Lone Bear's fist connected with his jaw, a precisely delivered blow that sent the gunman into unconsciousness with the finality of a hammer striking an anvil. Through the front window, Tom's rifle cracked again and the bullet carving a furrow in the wooden floor where Lone Bear had been standing moments before. Dr. Humphrey yelped and pressed himself flatter behind his desk, while Marshal Quentin tried to make himself invisible against the wall. "That's enough," Rourke bellowed from his corner, his cultured voice cracking with strain as his carefully laid plans dissolved into chaos. "Tom, cease firing immediately. We need her alive and coherent for the legal proceedings." The admission hung in the suddenly quiet air like smoke from a signal fire, confirming what Lone Bear had already suspected. Whatever Rourke's ultimate plans for Lillian, they required her breathing and conscious. That knowledge shifted the tactical balance slightly in their favor, but only slightly. Lillian had backed against the far wall the Derringer held in a 2-handed grip that spoke of previous experience with firearms under stress. Her green eyes swept the room constantly, cataloging threats and escape routes with the hyper-awareness of someone who'd learned that survival often depended on reading situations correctly. Lone Bear retrieved Pete's Spencer rifle, checking the action with practiced efficiency. 7 shots in the magazine if it was fully loaded enough to even the odds, if he used them wisely. The weapon was well maintained and sighted properly, suggesting that Pete had been a competent marksman before becoming an unconscious obstacle. The sound of approaching hoofbeats reached them through the chaos, multiple riders moving fast toward their position. Lone Bear's cousins had apparently decided that the situation called for more aggressive intervention than simply holding defensive positions. 2 elks, he called again in Cheyenne. Status. More riders coming from the ranch, came the urgent reply. Maybe 8 or 10. We need to move soon or we'll be trapped completely. The mathematics of their situation were shifting rapidly toward the impossible. Even with the element of surprise and superior individual skills, they couldn't hold off a determined assault by overwhelming numbers in an indefensible position. Dr. Humphrey raised his head cautiously above his desk, medical training overriding personal fear as he assessed the tactical situation with clinical precision. "There's a root cellar that connects to the Morrisons' general store next door," he said quietly. "Built during the Indian Wars as an escape route. If we can reach it." "Where?" Lone Bear asked, already moving toward the indicated direction, while keeping his rifle trained on potential entry points. "Behind those medicine shelves. The entrance is concealed, but I can open it quickly." As Dr. Humphrey began shifting bottles and supplies to reveal a hidden panel, Lillian moved closer to Lone Bear, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper that carried weight beyond its volume. "Before we leave this room, you need to know what I'm really carrying." She said, her hand going to that telltale spot on her dress seam. Because if we don't survive the next hour, someone needs to understand the truth about what's happening in this territory. Lone Bear nodded his attention, split between her words, and the tactical situation developing around them like storm clouds gathering for a final devastating assault. "Tell me quickly," he said. "Then we find a way to live long enough to use whatever you're hiding." In the relative safety of Dr. Humphrey's root cellar, surrounded by shelves of preserved vegetables and medical supplies that spoke of careful preparation for frontier hardships, Lillian's fingers worked at the hidden seam in her dress, with the desperate precision of someone whose life depended on what lay concealed beneath layers of cotton and careful stitching. The document that emerged was wrapped in oiled silk, its legal language dense with surveys and water rights that could reshape the balance of power across 3 counties. But it was more than just a deed. It was proof of systematic fraud, reaching from Willow Springs to the territorial capital and beyond. My husband's grandfather purchased water rights to the entire Ash River Basin in 1854. She explained, her voice barely above a whisper in the cramped underground space. The original territorial survey granted him control of every stream spring and water source from the mountains to the plains. Everything that makes life possible in this drought-stricken country. Lone Bear studied the document by lamplight, his dark eyes taking in legal descriptions that meant the difference between life and death for everyone who depended on water in the region. The implications were staggering. Whoever controlled the river controlled the territory itself. How did Rourke gain control if your family held legitimate rights? He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Forgery on a massive scale. Lillian replied, her green eyes bright with the kind of anger that had sustained her through weeks of imprisonment and forced medication. He's been creating false deeds and selling the same water rights to multiple buyers. When disputes arise, he uses guardianship proceedings to eliminate inconvenient claimants permanently. The implications hit Lone Bear like a physical blow. Rourke wasn't just stealing Lillian's inheritance. He was systematically defrauding every settler who'd bought land along the river, while using corrupt officials to legitimize theft on a scale that dwarfed simple cattle rustling or claim jumping. But there's more. She continued, her voice dropping even lower as footsteps creaked overhead. I found correspondence in my husband's papers letters between Rourke and territorial authorities discussing permanent solutions to inconvenient native populations along river systems. They're planning to provoke incidents that would justify military action against treaty-protected camps. Lone Bear's blood chilled as the meaning became clear. His grandmother's stories about Sand Creek had always included warnings about white officials who spoke of final solutions to the Indian problem. If Rourke was coordinating with territorial authorities to eliminate native presence along river systems, it meant more than individual survival was at stake. My grandmother always said the river would run red with blood before white men were satisfied. Lone Bear murmured, remembering her exact words spoken during those long winter nights when she'd shared the painful history of their people. She made me promise to help anyone who fought against such plans, no matter the color of their skin. The revelation that they shared a common enemy, that both their families had been targeted by the same systematic corruption, created a bond deeper than mere alliance. They were survivors of the same war fought on different battlefields, but directed by the same malevolent intelligence. There's something else. Lillian said, her hand finding his in the lamplight. Something my father told me about your grandmother before he died. He said she was gathering evidence about cavalry movements, trying to warn peaceful camps about planned attacks. He was supposed to help her get that information to federal authorities. Lone Bear's world shifted on its axis. His grandmother's death had been sudden, attributed to fever by tribal healers. But if she'd been working to expose military corruption, she died 3 days before a federal marshal was supposed to arrive. Lillian continued. My father always suspected it wasn't natural causes, but he couldn't prove anything. By the time I was old enough to understand, Rourke had already begun his systematic takeover of the territory. The sound of voices above them interrupted their conversation, forcing them to move deeper into the tunnel system that connected several buildings in the town's commercial district. Dr. Humphrey led the way with practiced ease, his medical bag slung over his shoulder, and a determined expression replacing his earlier uncertainty. They emerged in the Morrisons' general store just as Hannah appeared from the back room, her arms full of supplies hastily gathered for their escape. Her plain face was flushed with excitement and determination, the look of someone finally able to act on principles she'd held, but rarely been able to express. Joseph's waiting with his wagon at the north edge of town. She reported quietly, keeping her voice low to avoid attracting attention from customers who might still be in the front of the store. But Tom's got men watching all the main roads like hawks circling carry-on. You'll need to go cross-country if you want to reach Coal Creek alive. The plan was simple in concept, treacherous in execution. Joseph would create a diversion by driving his empty wagon east toward the river, crossing drawing pursuit away from the real escape route. Meanwhile, Lone Bear and Lillian would travel north on foot, using game trails and creek beds to avoid detection until they could reach sympathetic territory. "What about you?" Lillian asked Hannah, concern evident in her voice, despite their desperate circumstances. "Someone needs to stay and make sure the story gets told properly." Hannah replied with the quiet courage of a schoolteacher facing down unruly students. "Dr. Humphrey and I will make sure folks know what really happened here today." They'd covered 3 miles through sagebrush and rocky draws when Two Elks' warning whistle drifted across the prairie like the call of a night bird. The signal meant riders approaching from multiple directions more than could be explained by random travel or innocent purpose. "They've figured out the deception," Lone Bear observed, counting dust plumes visible against the starlit sky. "At least 6 riders, probably more. Coming fast and spread out to prevent us from slipping through their net." Lillian had been studying the terrain, while they traveled her mind, working with the strategic thinking her father had taught her during those secret lessons. What if we don't try to slip through? What if we circle around behind them instead? The suggestion surprised Lone Bear with its audacity, but it held tactical merit that appealed to his warrior's instincts. Instead of fleeing from their pursuers like frightened prey, they would use darkness and terrain to get behind enemy lines and turn the hunt around. "You think like a warrior," he said with genuine approval. "Dangerous thinking for a woman in this territory." "Dangerous thinking is what's kept me alive this long," she replied with the first real smile he'd seen from her since their ordeal began. The maneuver required precise timing and intimate knowledge of the landscape. But Lone Bear had been hunting this country since childhood. He led them in a wide arc that took advantage of every depression and shadow, every piece of cover the rolling prairie provided. Behind them, their pursuers continued on the false trail, while their quarry moved like ghosts through terrain that seemed empty but provided concealment for those who knew how to use it. By dawn, they had reached the Ash River at a point several miles upstream from the expected crossing. The water ran higher than normal for late September, fed by mountain storms that had turned the usually placid stream into a brown torrent capable of drowning the unwary. Currents running fast and deep, Lillian observed, studying the water with eyes that had learned to calculate risks against slim chances of survival. Too fast for horses, maybe too fast for people who can't swim strong. "Can you swim?" Lone Bear asked, testing the current with a long stick that bent alarmingly under the pressure of flowing water. "Like a fish," she replied with confidence born of hard experience. "My father believed girls should know how to save themselves, much to my mother's scandalized horror." said the frontier didn't care about feminine delicacy when it came to survival. They entered the water just as the sun cleared the horizon, using the blinding glare to mask their movements from any watchers on the opposite bank. The current hit like a cold shock, swirling around their legs, with enough force to knock them off balance if they weren't careful about foot placement and body position. Halfway across, disaster struck in the form of a massive cottonwood log that came spinning downstream like a battering ram, its broken branches reaching out like skeletal fingers of death itself. Lone Bear saw it first and pushed Lillian toward deeper water, taking the impact himself with a bone-jarring collision that left him stunned and gasping for air. She didn't hesitate for even a heartbeat. Diving beneath the muddy surface, she found him tangled in debris and pulled him free with strength, born of desperation and determination. They surfaced together, coughing brown water while fighting to reach the far bank before the current could sweep them beyond help. The effort left them both exhausted and shivering despite the warming sun. But they'd crossed successfully and gained precious time on their pursuers. More importantly, they'd proven to each other that their partnership was more than mere convenience. It was a bond forged in shared danger and mutual trust that ran deeper than words could express. As they wrung out their clothing and redistributed their gear, Lillian moved close to Lone Bear with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to treating injuries. Her fingers probed his scalp where the log had struck, checking for signs of serious damage with gentle competence. "You'll have an impressive bruise," she murmured, her touch surprisingly tender despite the urgency of their situation. "But the skull feels solid. Your grandmother's stories weren't wrong about thick-headed warriors." Their eyes met as she worked, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with medical treatment or tactical necessity. The shared danger had forged a connection deeper than simple alliance, a recognition that they'd willingly risked their lives for each other without hesitation or calculation. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice carrying weight beyond simple gratitude. "For the rescue and for trusting me with your family's secrets." "Thank you for listening," she replied, her fingers still resting against his temple. "And for not thinking a woman with education was too dangerous to help." The moment stretched between them like spun gold before practical necessity reasserted itself. They had miles yet to travel, and their pursuers would eventually realize their quarry had chosen an unexpected route. Time was their enemy, as much as bullets or ropes. But as they prepared to continue toward Coal Creek, both understood that something fundamental had changed between them. What had begun as desperate alliance was becoming something deeper. Not the romantic nonsense of penny novels, but the hard-earned trust that came from facing death together and choosing to protect each other above their own survival. The narrow canyon that led to Coal Creek had been carved by flash floods over thousands of years, creating walls of red sandstone that rose like cathedral spires toward a sky that seemed impossibly distant. It was beautiful country that could kill the unwary as efficiently as any human enemy, and Tom Callahan had chosen it well for what he intended as his final decisive ambush. They rode into the trap just after noon when the September sun hung directly overhead, and shadows provided no relief from heat that turned the rock faces into furnaces. Tom had positioned his remaining men on the rim rock above where they commanded perfect fields of fire across the narrow trail that offered no cover and no escape. The first shot came without warning, a rifle bullet that spanged off stone inches from Lone Bear's head before whining away into the desert's silence, like a hornet seeking new targets. By the time the echo faded from the canyon walls, they were already diving for whatever cover the rocky floor could provide, pressing themselves against boulders that offered scant protection from plunging fire. 4 shooters on the north rim, Glass-eyed Joe Morrison reported his single good eye calculating angles and distances with the precision of someone who'd survived more ambushes than he cared to count. Maybe 2 more behind those rock formations to the south. They've got us in a crossfire that would make a cavalry colonel proud. Joe had appeared at their camp the previous night like an answer to unspoken prayers, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies and carrying news that transformed their understanding of the forces arrayed against them. Hannah Morrison's uncle possessed a reputation for honesty, matched only by his skill with rifle and rope. But it was the information he carried that proved most valuable. "Been tracking your movement since yesterday evening," he'd announced without preamble, his weathered face bearing the marks of someone who'd lived through more violence than most people could imagine. "Figured you might need help reaching Coal Creek with your scalps still attached to your heads." But Joe's presence hadn't been the real surprise. As he'd led them to his concealed camp among ancient cottonwoods, he'd begun revealing information that transformed their understanding of everything that had happened. "Rourke didn't just steal your water rights, Miss Brennan," he'd said quietly, checking their surroundings for signs of pursuit with the paranoid caution of a man who understood that carelessness meant death. "And he didn't just murder your father for his inheritance, though that's certainly part of it." The accusation had hung in the evening air like gun smoke, but Joe hadn't been finished with his revelations. "That bastard's been systematically murdering anyone who might threaten his empire for over 20 years. He'd continued his single eye fixed on Lone Bear with an intensity that made the silence stretch uncomfortably. "Including your grandmother, young warrior. The woman who survived Sand Creek only to die mysteriously after asking too many questions about cavalry movements and treaty violations." The revelation had hit Lone Bear like a physical blow. His grandmother's death had been sudden, attributed to fever by tribal healers who'd done their best with limited knowledge and resources. Natural death after a long life of hardship seemed reasonable, even expected. But Joe's words carried the ring of truth that made his stomach clench with possibilities he'd never considered. Now crouched behind inadequate cover, while bullets chipped stone all around their position, Lone Bear found himself thinking about his grandmother's final words with new understanding. Her fevered insistence about the green-eyed woman who would come seeking justice hadn't been delirium. It had been prophecy born of knowledge she'd died trying to share. Lillian had found shelter behind a fallen boulder, the borrowed derringer steady in her hands despite circumstances that would have panicked most people into helpless terror. Her green eyes swept the canyon walls with tactical awareness that spoke of lessons learned during their escape from Willow Springs. "How much ammunition do we have?" She called, her voice calm, despite bullets that chipped stone all around their position. "Enough if we're careful and lucky." Lone Bear replied, returning fire with the Spencer rifle he'd taken from Pete. "Not enough if we get careless or if they decide to wait us out until reinforcements arrive." The mathematics of their situation were brutally simple. Tom's men held the high ground with superior numbers and what appeared to be unlimited ammunition supplies, while the trapped party had limited resources and no realistic hope of reinforcement. Unless something changed quickly, the ambush would succeed in its ultimate purpose. But Glass-Eyed Joe had surprises of his own. Reaching into his saddlebags, he produced a stick of dynamite left over from his mining days, its waxy surface marked with handling that spoke of someone who understood explosives with intimate familiarity. "Been saving this for a special occasion," he announced with grim satisfaction that transformed his weathered features. "Reckon this qualifies better than Christmas morning or my own funeral." The explosion that followed brought down half the canyon wall in a roar of falling stone that temporarily ended the gunfire from above. Dust clouds rolled across the narrow space like fog, providing concealment for movement that would have been suicidal under normal circumstances. They used the confusion to advance up the canyon, moving in tactical bounds that kept them covered while closing distance to their destination. But Tom's men recovered quickly from the shock of Joe's demolition work, resuming fire that filled the air with lead and rock fragments that could maim or kill with equal efficiency. The railroad trestle that spanned Devil's Gorge represented the triumph of industrial engineering over natural obstacles, its wooden framework stretching nearly 200 feet across space that dropped away into shadows and swirling water far below. Under normal circumstances, crossing would have been simple enough for anyone not afflicted with fear of heights. But circumstances were far from normal. Smoke was already rising from the structure's far-end dark columns that spoke of coal oil and malicious intent applied by men who understood the tactical value of controlling key terrain features. "How long before the whole thing comes down?" Lillian asked, studying the flames that were already consuming support beams with hungry efficiency. "Maybe 5 minutes if we're lucky and the wind doesn't pick up." Joe estimated his experienced eye reading the fire's progress with accuracy born of hard-won knowledge. 3 minutes if they used more coal oil than I'm guessing, or if those support timbers are drier than they look. Lone Bear tested the structure's stability by stepping onto the first span, feeling vibrations that spoke of wood beginning to fail under heat stress that would soon render the entire bridge impassable. But the alternative was surrender. And surrender meant death for all of them, probably after considerable unpleasantness that none of them wanted to contemplate. "Soak everything in creek water," he ordered, leading them down to the stream that flowed far below the burning trestle. "We go across fast, and we go across wet, or we don't go across at all." The crossing began like a journey through the underworld itself. Flames licked at support beams while smoke obscured vision and made breathing a constant struggle against air that seemed too thin and too hot for human lungs. The wooden planks beneath their feet were already beginning to char and weaken from heat that rose from below, like something straight from the depths of hell. Halfway across, a burning timber crashed down directly in front of them, blocking their path with debris that glowed like coals in a blacksmith's forge. Lone Bear used his rifle butt to clear the obstacle, while Lillian fought to control horses that were half-mad with terror at the fire surrounding them on all sides. Rifle shots cracked from the far end of the bridge, but smoke and flame made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Tom's men were firing blind, hoping for lucky hits rather than aiming with the precision that effective marksmanship required. A nail worked loose from Lone Bear's boot sole, the hot metal pressing against his foot with each step like a brand applied by some invisible torturer. Pain shot up his leg with every stride, but stopping meant death for all of them, so he pressed forward despite injury that would have incapacitated weaker men or those with less at stake. 2 minutes, Joe shouted over the roar of flames that were consuming the bridge's structural integrity with frightening speed. Maybe less if those crossbeams fail. They reached the far end, just as major structural members began to fail with groans that sounded like dying animals in mortal agony. The bridge sagged ominously under their weight as they rolled off onto solid ground, and within minutes, the entire center span collapsed into the gorge with a roar like thunder rolling across the plains. Tom and his remaining men had retreated to defensive positions among the rocks above the landing, while new smoke columns rising from Coal Creek's direction suggested that the violence was spreading beyond their immediate conflict into something approaching open warfare. But their troubles were far from over. The siege of Coal Creek's courthouse would test everything they'd learned about survival trust and the price of justice in a territory where law bent whichever way money and power decreed. Coal Creek's courthouse sat on a rise overlooking the settlement like a wooden monument to justice, in a land where such concepts often proved as fragile as morning frost. Built of timber and determination by settlers who believed in law, even when law failed to believe in them, it had survived political upheavals, economic panics, and the occasional outburst of violence that marked frontier life with permanent scars. Today, it was under siege, and justice itself hung in the balance. Federal Marshal Williams had arrived just hours before with a handful of deputies and a stack of arrest warrants, but Rourke's men had surrounded the building with marksmen positioned to prevent anyone from entering or leaving alive. Smoke rose from several points around town, where buildings had been set ablaze to create chaos and provide cover for what was clearly intended as a final assault on anyone who might testify against the territorial corruption that had flourished unchecked for too long. Inside the courthouse, Judge Morrison examined the evidence they'd brought with the methodical precision of someone who understood that his decisions would reshape territorial politics for years to come. The documents Joe had gathered, combined with Lillian's deed and her testimony about forced medication and systematic fraud, painted a picture of corruption that reached from local magistrates all the way to the territorial capital. This evidence is substantial and damning. The judge announced, his voice carrying easily across the crowded courtroom despite the chaos developing outside. But presenting it properly will require careful legal procedure that could take hours to complete, time we may not have if our enemies are determined to prevent testimony through violence. Through the courthouse windows, they could see Tom's men moving into final positions with the systematic precision of soldiers preparing for assault. The siege had been carefully planned to prevent any evidence from reaching federal authorities, even if it meant burning down the entire town to accomplish that goal. They're not just trying to stop testimony. Marshal Williams observed grimly, checking his weapons with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd survived numerous gunfights through preparation and vigilance. They're trying to eliminate all witnesses permanently. This is the last stand of desperate men with nothing left to lose. The attack came with the coordination of men who'd planned their assault carefully and understood exactly what was at stake. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions as Tom's followers opened fire on the courthouse from concealed positions throughout Coal Creek, turning the peaceful settlement into a battlefield, where innocent lives hung in the balance alongside abstract concepts of justice and law. Glass shattered as rifle bullets punched through windows that had been designed to let in light rather than stop lead. Federal deputies returned fire with the discipline that spoke of military training, but they were outnumbered and surrounded by enemies who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from preventing testimony that would expose decades of systematic corruption. "They're trying to burn us out," Dr. Humphrey shouted from his position near the main entrance, where smoke was beginning to seep through gaps in the wooden walls that had never been designed to withstand sustained assault. Flames licked at the building's foundation, where attackers had splashed coal oil with the systematic thoroughness of men who understood fire's potential as a weapon of destruction. The courthouse had become a trap that would consume everyone inside, unless the siege could be broken quickly and decisively. But help wasn't coming from outside. The federal marshals who might have turned the tide were pinned down at the edge of town by riflemen who'd been positioned specifically to prevent reinforcement. Whatever happened in the courthouse would be decided by those already inside, fighting for their lives and for principles that seemed increasingly abstract, as bullets shattered the symbols of civilization around them. Lone Bear moved through the smoke-filled building with the fluid grace of a warrior who'd learned to fight in close quarters where hesitation meant death and victory went to those who combined skill with ruthless determination. His knife gleamed in the firelight as he sought Tom Callahan with the focused intensity of a hunter tracking wounded prey through terrain that grew more dangerous with each passing moment. He found his quarry in the judge's chambers, where Tom was attempting to destroy the remaining evidence by feeding papers into flames that were already consuming portions of the building's interior. The outlaw looked up from his work with eyes that held the desperate cunning of a cornered wolf who understands that survival requires eliminating all threats, no matter the cost. "Should have stayed on your reservation, Redskin." Tom snarled, drawing his Navy Colt with the practice speed that spoke of countless gunfights survived through luck skill and the willingness to kill without hesitation or remorse. Now, you get to die for nothing more important than a crazy woman's property claims and legal delusions. The gunfight that followed was brief and savage, conducted at ranges where marksmanship mattered less than speed, and the determination to survive at any cost. Tom's first shot went wide, thrown off by smoke that made accurate aiming nearly impossible, and by pain from wounds he'd sustained during the canyon ambush. Lone Bear's reply was more precise, the bullet taking his opponent in the shoulder and spinning him around like a child's toy. But Tom wasn't finished. Drawing a hideout gun from his boot with his left hand, he launched himself at Lone Bear with the desperate fury of a cornered animal that understands death is coming, but refuses to accept it without a fight. They went down together in a tangle of arms and legs that sent furniture crashing across the wooden floor, which was already beginning to smolder from the spreading fire. The fight became personal, then conducted with knives and fists in close quarters, where training and experience meant everything, and luck counted for almost nothing. Tom had size and reach advantages, but Lone Bear possessed the kind of conditioning that came from years of warfare against overwhelming odds, and the knowledge that defeat meant not just personal death, but the failure of a sacred trust. 1 minute before this whole place comes down, someone shouted from outside the chamber, the warning barely audible over the roar of flames and the crash of collapsing timber. Lone Bear made a split-second decision that would haunt him for years to come. Instead of finishing Tom with a knife thrust that would end the threat permanently, he struck with the pommel, rendering his enemy unconscious, but alive. In that moment of choice, warrior's honor overcame practical necessity. "You'll stand trial," he said to the unconscious form, his voice carrying conviction despite the chaos around them. "Justice requires witnesses, even unwilling ones, who'd prefer to take their secrets to unmarked graves." While Lone Bear battled Tom in the courthouse's upper level, Lillian found herself facing an even more dangerous opponent in the form of Maxim Rourke himself. The cattle baron had entered the building through a rear entrance, seeking to eliminate the one person whose continued existence threatened his entire, carefully constructed empire. But Rourke wasn't alone in his desperation. With him came the full weight of revelation that transformed everything they thought they understood about their situation and the forces that had shaped their lives. "My dear niece," he said, his cultured voice carrying undertones of steel that spoke of violence barely restrained beneath a veneer of civilized behavior. "You've caused me considerable inconvenience with your stubborn refusal to accept proper medical treatment and legal guardianship." The word niece confirmed what she'd suspected since their first confrontation in Dr. Humphrey's clinic. But hearing it spoken aloud still hit like a physical blow. Lillian's face went white as desert bones, but her gun hand remained steady as she faced the man who destroyed her family for profit. "Uncle Maxime," she replied with bitter emphasis that carried all the weight of betrayed blood and murdered trust. "I should have known when I found Father's letters describing his older brother who'd sell his own mother for the right price and call it sound business practice." Rourke's smile held no warmth whatsoever, revealing teeth as white and sharp as a predator's fangs. "Your father was weak and sentimental, entirely unsuited for the kind of work that builds empires from wilderness and transforms chaos into profitable order. I simply accelerated his natural demise when he threatened to expose certain business arrangements that were too profitable to abandon." The admission was delivered with casual cruelty that spoke of someone who'd long ago abandoned any pretense of human decency in favor of raw power and unlimited greed. But it also explained his desperate need to control her through guardianship rather than simple murder. Family inheritance laws would raise uncomfortable questions if the direct heir died under mysterious circumstances. "You killed him for water rights that would have been yours through family connection anyway." Lillian realized understanding flooding her voice with horror and rage that had been building for months. Your own brother murdered for property and power you could have shared. Patience was never my virtue, Rourke replied with the casual dismissal of a man discussing livestock rather than human lives. And your father's conscience was becoming increasingly inconvenient for business operations that required a certain flexibility regarding legal and moral constraints. Before either could fire, the courthouse's main door burst open to admit a development that should have changed the entire equation. Federal marshals poured through the entrance, followed by deputy U.S. marshals who'd been summoned by telegraph from the Capitol. But their arrival proved less decisive than expected. Tom's men had prepared for this possibility, positioning riflemen to pin down any reinforcements, while the main assault continued unabated. Rourke still held his weapon trained on Lillian, with the steady hand of a man who'd killed before and would again without hesitation or remorse. Around them, the courthouse burned while armed men fought for control of evidence that could reshape the territory's political future. "She dies with me," he announced with calm finality that spoke of a man who'd accepted his own destruction but refused to face it alone. "Better no heir than a troublesome heir who'd undo everything I've built over decades of careful work." That's when Lone Bear appeared in the doorway behind Rourke, moving with the silent grace of a hunting cat, despite injuries from his fight with Tom Callahan. His throwing knife left his hand in a perfect arc that struck Rourke's gun hand, sending the weapon clattering away across the courthouse floor in a spray of blood and profanity. But Rourke wasn't finished. Drawing a hidden derringer from his vest pocket with movements that spoke of long practice and desperate determination, he aimed for Lillian's heart with the accuracy of a man making his final gamble with death itself. Lillian's borrowed pistol spoke first, the small derringer's report, sharp and final in the smoke-filled chamber. Rourke staggered backward, surprise replacing calculation in his eyes as he realized that his empire was ending not through complex legal maneuvering, but through simple justice delivered by the woman he'd tried to destroy. He fell against the judge's bench and slid to the floor, his expensive suit stained with blood that pooled beneath him like spilled wine. His last words were a whispered curse that carried no power beyond hatred and the recognition of final absolute defeat. 30 seconds, Marshal Williams shouted from somewhere in the chaos. "Everyone out before this building collapses completely." They evacuated just as the courthouse roof began to sag under the weight of flames and structural failure that could no longer be ignored or overcome. Outside in Coal Creek's main street, they watched as justice and injustice burned together in a conflagration that would mark the end of one era and the beginning of another. The weeks that followed the courthouse battle passed in a blur of legal proceedings, medical treatment, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding lives that had been shattered by corruption and violence. Coal Creek became a temporary territorial capital as federal investigators worked to untangle the web of fraud and murder that had entangled 3 territories in systematic theft disguised as legitimate business. Dr. Humphrey worked tirelessly in his makeshift clinic, treating wounds that ranged from bullet holes to smoke inhalation. His hands had healed enough to allow surgical work, though he would never again possess the delicate touch that had made him famous throughout the region. The experience had changed him, hardening his resolve to serve justice as well as medicine. Hannah Morrison faced considerable hostility for her role in exposing the conspiracy, but her courage had inspired others to speak truth to power. The school she'd hoped to expand remained a distant dream, as the community struggled with the reality that change came slowly and at great cost to those who dared challenge established order. Joseph Brennan found himself suddenly free of the crushing debt that had threatened to destroy his family, as territorial investigators ruled that his mortgage payments had been based on fraudulent claims to his land. For the first time in years, He could plan crops without worrying whether water rights would be cut off by men who considered farmers expendable in their larger schemes. But the social cost was high. Many neighbors viewed him with suspicion for his association with the woman who'd brought such upheaval to their settled world. Glass-Eye Joe Morrison received a federal appointment as territorial investigator, his experience with Rourke's methods making him invaluable in tracking down the remaining threads of conspiracy that reached into neighboring territories and federal agencies. But the work was dangerous, and he knew that powerful enemies remained who would prefer him dead rather than testimony. It was in the quiet moments away from legal proceedings and public scrutiny that the real healing began for those who'd survived the ordeal. On a cold morning when frost silvered the prairie grass and their breath made clouds in the still air, Lillian sat beside Lone Bear near the creek that ran behind Dr. Humphrey's clinic. Her hands had healed from the rope burns and gunpowder residue, leaving only thin scars that she wore like badges of survival earned through courage rather than chance. "I keep thinking about your grandmother," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the water's murmur. "How she saw this coming, how she tried to prevent it, and how she died for the attempt." Lone Bear's hands stilled on the rifle he'd been cleaning, considering the weight of what they'd learned about the deaths that had shaped their lives. Around them, Coal Creek was stirring to life, with sounds that spoke of normal existence rather than the violence that had marked their recent experience. "She would have liked you," he said finally, understanding the deeper meaning behind Lillian's words. She always said courage came in different forms, but courage shared made everyone stronger than they could be alone. She was right about the green eyes. Lillian observed with the first genuine laugh he'd heard from her since their ordeal began. Though I suspect she was more prophet than fortune-teller. They'd learned each other's languages, both spoken and unspoken, during their journey through danger and revelation. He'd taught her to read weather signs and track game through difficult terrain. She'd shown him legal procedures and business practices that would help his people navigate the complex world of territorial politics and federal bureaucracy. But more than knowledge, they'd shared something deeper, the recognition that survival often depended on trusting someone whose world was completely different from your own. That evening, as purple shadows gathered in the eastern sky, and cooking fires sent smoke toward the first stars, they walked together to the creek where their pursuit had begun weeks earlier. The water ran clear now, no longer stained with blood or clouded by the ash of burned bridges and destroyed dreams. "Federal investigators want us to testify in Denver." Lillian mentioned her hand finding his with the naturalness of long practice and shared experience. Against the territorial officials who took Rourke's money in exchange for information about treaty negotiations and the locations of protected camps. Lone Bear nodded, understanding the implications of what she proposed. Their testimony would carry weight precisely because it came from sources that couldn't be easily dismissed: a Cheyenne war leader and a white woman whose courage had been proven under fire, whose shared loss gave them common cause that transcended the boundaries others tried to enforce. "We'll go," he said simply, his voice carrying the quiet certainty that had sustained them through impossible odds. "Justice requires witnesses who are willing to speak truth, regardless of personal cost or political consequences." But he knew, as she did, that their partnership would face challenges beyond courtrooms and legal proceedings. The world they'd fought to change remained largely unchanged, still full of people who would see their alliance as unnatural, dangerous, or both. 3 months had passed since the courthouse battle, and the territory was slowly settling into new patterns shaped more by justice than by corruption. Though change came grudgingly, and at great cost to those who dared challenge the established order. Denver's federal court had handed down sentences that would reshape political power for decades, but the social transformation would take much longer. Rather than the dramatic changes some had hoped for, life in Willow Springs had returned to something approaching normalcy, which meant that prejudice and suspicion remained powerful forces in determining who belonged and who didn't. Hannah Morrison continued teaching, but her hopes for expanding education to include children of all backgrounds remained largely unfulfilled. The community had accepted the legal necessity of change without embracing its spirit. Dr. Humphrey's practice had expanded slightly to include occasional consultation with traditional healers from various tribes, but such cooperation remained controversial and limited. His clinic had become a symbol of possibility rather than transformation, hope for what might be rather than celebration of what was. Joseph Brennan's farm flourished with reliable water access and freedom from crushing debt, but social acceptance remained elusive. His daughter Mary had become one of Hannah's most promising students, but the girl faced whispers and sideways glances that spoke of a community uncomfortable with the changes her family's alliance had brought. On a crisp autumn morning, when cottonwood leaves painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber, a small group gathered at the site where Willow Springs' new courthouse was being constructed. The building would serve multiple counties its federal funding, ensuring that justice would no longer depend entirely on local political considerations or the whims of powerful ranchers. But this was not a public ceremony. The crowd was small, consisting only of those who'd proven themselves willing to stand against corruption, regardless of personal cost. Hannah Morrison, Dr. Humphrey Joseph Brennan, and his daughter Glass-Eye Joe, and a handful of others whose courage had been tested and proven. Lone Bear stood among them wearing a mixture of traditional and contemporary clothing that reflected his role as a bridge between worlds that were learning to coexist rather than simply compete for dominance. His presence commanded respect from both cultures, but that respect had been earned through actions rather than granted through social acceptance. Lillian approached him across the construction site with measured steps that honored both traditions represented in the small gathering. Her dress was simple but elegant, decorated with beadwork that told stories of survival and triumph over impossible odds. Her auburn hair caught the morning sunlight like copper wire, and her green eyes held the calm confidence of someone who'd found her place in a changing world, even if that world hadn't entirely found room for her. The assembled group expected some form of formal ceremony, perhaps declarations of partnership or commitment that would satisfy conventional expectations about how relationships should be acknowledged and celebrated. Instead, Lone Bear's words surprised everyone into complete silence, including those who thought they understood what was about to happen. "I will not take a wife who came to me through desperation," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the small gathering without need for artificial amplification. Such a union would be built on weakness, rather than strength, on necessity, rather than choice freely made and freely given. Murmurs of confusion rippled through the group as people tried to understand what they were witnessing. Some faces showed concern that something was going wrong with proceedings they'd assumed would formalize the relationship that had been forged through shared danger. But Lillian's expression remained calm, even expectant, as if she'd known this moment would come, and had prepared herself for whatever it might bring. Lone Bear continued his words, carefully chosen to honor both his heritage and hers, while creating something entirely new from their shared experience and mutual loss. "My grandmother made me promise something before she died," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet gathering with the weight of sacred obligation. "She made me swear that if I ever found someone who shared her spirit, someone willing to fight for justice, no matter the cost to themselves, I would ask that person to be my partner in work that outlasts both our individual lives." The revelation transformed the entire meaning of what they were witnessing. This wasn't rejection of their relationship, but fulfillment of a promise made years before. Either had known the other existed, a destiny that had been shaped by forces beyond their understanding or control. She said building bridges between worlds required people willing to stand in dangerous places where others feared to go. He continued extending his hand toward Lillian in a gesture that carried weight beyond simple romantic symbolism. Will you stand with me in those dangerous places as my equal partner in whatever struggles the future may bring? Lillian's answer came not in words, but in action that spoke more clearly than any speech or formal declaration. She placed her hand over his heart, feeling the steady rhythm that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat during their shared trials and triumphs. "I accept," she said simply, her voice carrying across the silent gathering with perfect clarity despite its quiet tone. "Not as your rescued victim or your grateful dependent, but as your chosen partner in honoring those we've lost and protecting those who will come after us." The small crowd erupted in restrained applause as the true meaning of what they'd witnessed penetrated consciousness shaped by conventional expectations about marriage and partnership. This wasn't just a private ceremony, it was the founding moment of something unprecedented, a joining of individuals who represented different communities that had been separated by generations of mutual mistrust and systematic violence. But the real significance lay not in public recognition, but in private commitment. This was a partnership that would face opposition and suspicion from both worlds, a relationship that could survive only through mutual respect and shared dedication to principles that transcended personal happiness or social acceptance. As the small celebration continued around them, Lone Bear and Lillian walked together toward the creek where their pursuit had begun months earlier. The water ran clear and steady, reflecting autumn colors that spoke of cycles ending and beginning with the natural rhythm that governed all life, regardless of human ambition or prejudice. At sunset, they planted a young cottonwood beside the creek, its roots reaching toward water that would sustain growth through seasons of drought and plenty. Into the tree's bark, Lone Bear carved 2 names in Cheyenne script, while Lillian added an inscription in English. "Here 2 worlds learned to trust, October 1874. The tree would weather storms and years, marking the place where enemies had become allies and strangers had chosen to become family-bound by shared purpose, rather than simple attraction or romantic sentiment. But more than symbol, it represented commitment to work that would span decades and face opposition that would test their partnership in ways they could barely imagine. Behind them, voices rose in songs that blended languages and traditions, creating harmony from what had once been discord and mutual incomprehension. The mad white woman's desperate plea had become something neither she nor the Cheyenne warrior could have imagined when they first faced each other in Willow Springs' dusty street. Not just salvation from immediate danger, but the foundation for building bridges between worlds that had forgotten how to trust each other. Their answer to hatred had been understanding earned through shared suffering. Their response to corruption had been justice pursued at great personal cost. Their reply to division had been unity forged through sacrifice and mutual respect that transcended the boundaries others had tried to make permanent and absolute. And in the end, that commitment to each other and to the work that lay ahead had made all the difference between a territory ruled by fear and the possibility of a community built on hope for tomorrow's potential secured by promises made to the dead and kept by the living who understood that some bridges were worth any price to build and maintain.